is my dear colleague and friend, Andrew Lehmann. He's a PhD student, very successful PhD student here at Macquarie University. And his field of research is the shock waves in star-forming disks. Scary. However, Andrew likes astrophotography. And tonight he's going to give us a talk about astrophotography with telescopes that he's doing here on campus. So, Andrew?
Thanks, Danica. Thank you. Yeah, hopefully I can get those claps at the end of the talk too. Okay, so can everybody hear me at the back of the room? Oh, fine, cool. As Danica said, I'm a PhD student here, and I'm actually a theorist. So in my daily life, all I get to do is take a look at equations and program them into computers. And as much as I really love those equations, I genuinely love the mathematics, that's not what got me into astronomy, and that's not what people think of when they think of astronomy. Of course, it's the visual beauty of astronomy that most people are interested in. That's what motivates me, and I'm sure that's why most of you are here tonight. So, for example, there's a really great website called Astronomy Picture of the Day. The website's up here, apod.nasa.gov. I suggest you all take a look at this every single day, because every day they post a new a photo of some astronomical object, and there'll be a small blurb under there of a professional astronomer explaining the photo. And this particular one, just this week, May 10 it shows Saturn and Mars. They're these two bright spots in this image in front of a bunch of gas clouds in the background from the Milky Way, with lots of colors in there. These are reflection nebulae and some dark silhouetting clouds. Of course, and since I study clouds, I really love looking at clouds. I find them to be very pretty, but other objects in astronomy are also pretty. This is a globular cluster. It's simply a whole bunch of stars in the same location, and it's just a million dots, and yet it's still extremely pretty. Yeah. And of course, there are also galaxies out there. We live in a galaxy, but there are other galaxies. This one is a spiral galaxy, much like our own. Our galaxy might look something like this, it might not. It's not clear because we're inside, so it's hard to see. And these are also some of the most beautiful objects in the sky. And so I think, in general, when we think of astronomy, when we look on social media, we see all these really beautiful pictures. But then when we go outside at night, we live in a really big city, and we look at the sky, and it might look something like this. It's a little bit less interesting than the images we see on the internet. This is actually a photo taken from our observatory on campus. So it's in Sydney, and you don't see many stars. There are some stars, and I still think it's pretty to look up at the sky at night in Sydney. But because of the light pollution of Sydney, because of the bright lights in the city, you don't get to see as much. If you go out into the country, away from the bright lights, you might see something that looks like this. You see a lot more stars. This is an image, hopefully you can see it nicely here. This is an image by some astronomy students at Macquarie. Every year they get to take a trip up at Coonabarabran, where there's a bunch of telescopes out there for Australia. And you can see a lot more stars. You can even see a hint of the Milky Way band in this image, maybe. And so that's one problem with looking at stars in a big city. You have that light pollution. But another problem is highlighted by this guy here. Owls, they have very, very big eyes. We do not have very big eyes. We have these small pupils. And if you had big eyes, you simply let more light into those eyes. And letting more light into those eyes lets you see more objects, lets you see fainter objects. And so while it'd be great to biologically do this, we can't stretch out our eye. We have to artificially do this with telescopes. A telescope is our way of becoming like an owl, creating a bigger pupil for our eyeballs. So let me talk about the telescopes that we have on campus. Here are the two domes. It's just a 5-minute walk up a hill. I think it's in that direction if I'm oriented right. Yeah, we've had these two domes here, I believe, since the early 90s or late 80s. It's been a while. Inside of these two domes, we have our two telescopes. There's a 12-inch telescope. The 12-inch telescope lives in the right-hand side dome here. And the other dome, there's a 16-inch telescope. They're both Meade telescopes. They're both on equatorial mounts, which is nice for tracking the night sky. Now, it's not enough to just have a telescope. I mean, if you look through that, you'll see more things. But of course, you won't get to show anybody else that because you can't record those images. So you also need a camera. So what we have here is one of the cameras. We have two cameras, but this is one that we use. We put it behind the 16-inch telescope. It's an Attic 11,000 camera. There's a bunch of specs taken off their website. But what I want to point out is that this camera is attached, and in between the camera and the telescope there's also this black thing here. This is a filter wheel because our camera is a monochrome camera. It just takes light and gives you a black and white image. But you can put filters in front of that camera, and so you can take a red image, change the filter, take a blue image, take a green image, and later on with software, which I'll talk about, you can combine those images to make 3-color images. And the beautiful thing about our setup is we have this software called SkyX. That SkyX controls our telescope. It moves it around. You just say, go to your favorite object, moves the telescope there. That software also controls the camera, so you can take photos with that software. And it also controls the filter wheel, so you can automatically change the filter wheels. So it's a very nice piece of software. So what I want to do now is go over a few of the highlights of some of the images that we took. I want to highlight also that I'm just as much an amateur in astrophotography as anybody else around here. Just because I'm doing a PhD, I'm not doing it on photography. So I started this about 6 months ago, and I'm learning the ropes now as I go along. So for the sake of my ego, please squint at these images. Don't look too closely. So here's a globular cluster called 47 Tuc. It's 1 million stars. It was a very obvious early target to try to take a photo of. I think this came out kind of well. And you can see it's just black and white. This is just a monochrome image right now. I think it's just a clear filter, so let all the light in, see what happens. I forgot to mention that the point of the camera as well is to take long exposure photography. Your eyes are actually kind of video cameras. They're adapted to take lots of images very quickly, at about 25 images a second. And because you're doing that, you're not letting in a lot of light into your eyes. But with a camera, you can just let that go on for very long. Take a minute exposure, let a minute of light come in there, and build up a nice image of faint objects. So at this point, I'm just looking through a magazine at objects that I should take a look at. And it says, take a look at this NGC 2347. So I take this photo, and it doesn't look very spectacular. But then, if you look really closely in here, there's this little thing. This is an object called a Planetary Nebula. It happens to be, there's quite a lot of these around. I took a few photos of Planetary Nebulae. They happen to be kind of the end product, the end of the lifetime of an average star. An average star becomes a red giant, puffs up, throws away all its outer envelopes, burps quite a lot, and then it leaves behind this central core, this central hot core, which heats up that gas that it threw away that used to be on its outer envelopes. And then that gas that used to be there, it glows. It glows and gives you these pretty pictures. It gives you these pretty colors. And in fact, the colors here are slightly meaningful. They're not arbitrary colors. I'll talk more about the colors later, but in these objects, they represent the physical atoms that are there. In general, the red stuff in these images will be hydrogen atoms because we use a filter that just gives you a hydrogen emission. And the blue will be oxygen, and then usually yellow will be sulfur. So I told you that I got that from magazines. I was just finding out what targets to look for, and then I discovered this really good website called DSO Browser. The DSO stands for Deep Sky Objects. So it's a really good website that you can put in your location. You can see maybe it says Macquarie Park there. You put in your location down to the coordinates, and it tells you what objects are up in that particular night. And it gives you a list. It tells you how bright those objects are. It tells you how big they are. It gives you photos that other people have taken of those objects. And then at the bottom, it really has this important graph called an hourly elevation, which shows you how high that object's going to be at a particular time of that night. And for this object, it happens to be really high up at 3 a.m. in the morning. And so if you want to take an image of that object, you have to know you have to be up at 3 a.m. in the morning. So this is a really good website. If you want to get into astrophotography, I suggest you take a look at this. Okay, so from that website, I found out that the Carina Nebula was something I really wanted to take an image of. And so this is one of the first images I took of it. And I thought this turned out really well. This was a really pretty image. This Carina Nebula is an object called an H2 region. It's mostly ionized hydrogen. It's a whole bunch of gas, and it's kind of the leftover gas from the original cloud that collapsed to form stars. So actually there's a couple star clusters in this nebula which are recently born. And because they're recently born, the gas is still around, because as time goes by, stars in these clusters tend to wipe out the gas, trying to throw it away. And so it's really good to see young clusters, because you get this beautiful gas that's still around to take this image. We also took some images of some galaxies. So in the top left there's the Centaurus A galaxy. I think it's edge on. I never really know what I'm looking at with Centaurus A. It's a really messy object. I took this Centaurus A, that's just earlier this week actually. It was on Wednesday night when I took this photo. On the bottom right is the southern Pinwheel galaxy. That's a kind of nice spiral galaxy, which is much like what our galaxy will look like if you could get outside our galaxy. And I actually got interrupted by bad weather with that one. I spent about an hour taking that photo, and then the clouds came in and I had to leave. So I really think that could be better, and I'd love to revisit that object. Then I talked about the telescope for a bit. Our software controls all the different parts, but it also controls something called an auto-guider. So all the previous images were taken without auto-guiding. And the auto-guider is a little camera on the side of your telescope that just focuses on one star in your image and tries to make sure that the telescope tracks that star very closely. And that is a very powerful tool, it turns out. It lets you take much longer exposure photographs. And so this was the first thing I took once I sort of figured out how to use the auto-guider. It's a little bit finicky, but this turned out really well. And this made me realize that once I can take really long exposure photographs, I can start getting much better images. This is the Gabriela Mistral Nebula. It happens to be kind of near the Carina Nebula, but it's harder to spot because it's much more fainter. So it requires this long exposure photography. And so once I got this auto-guider working, I thought I would revisit the Carina Nebula. And so I went back to this, this region and took another photo. And so I overlay that here. So I'm going to go back and forth to show you that once we figured out the auto-guider, the image gets a lot better. If you look at the stars get smaller. So the tracking is done a lot better. And if you look at the gas regions, you can see a lot more detail in there. And so this, if we now just look at that, focus on that, very pretty. I'm very happy at the way this came out. I still think it can get better, and I'm going to come back to this target over and over again as I get more skills, I think. And so for the rest of this talk, I want to focus on this object. I'm going to break it down how I built this color image. And so I did that with the help of some software, some stacking software called Mistral. It's a free software for Linux, because I use a Linux computer. If you use Windows, there's a program called Deep Sky Stacker, which is a similar thing. And that's also free. There's a great amateur astronomer community out there that's producing all this free software that lets you do these things. So this software, if you take all your calibration images, you take a bunch of photos, you shove it into there, and then the software stacks them up and creates most of your image for you. And then you have to do something at the end, which I'll get to. So the process goes a little bit like this. So in the top right-hand side of this, there's a spectrum. It shows you the rainbow, and just above that rainbow, there's a little red bar there. That red bar shows you the filter that I'm using for this image. It shows you that I'm blocking out everything except that little red bar. And that bar is at H alpha, at a particular wavelength, and it lets in light from ionized hydrogen. And that happens to be the most numerous element out there, and so that's why it's a really popular filter to use. So you put this filter in front of your camera, you take a long exposure photograph. In this case, I've been taking 5-minute exposure photographs. And I take a bunch of them, 3 on the left. They are actually slightly different images. And then those 3 5-minute exposures, you calibrate them, put them into my Mistral program, and it combines them. It stacks them up so that it's like a 15-minute exposure image. And you get more detail, more contrast in your image. So you do that with your filter. This is that same image. This is the H-alpha filter. And I also did it with a different filter. This one, if you look at the bottom, the little bar moved over to the left. This is now an O3 filter. It lets in light from ionized oxygen. And if you look at the image, it's slightly different. It shows you that the oxygen and the hydrogen, slightly different amounts of those are around. They might be in slightly different regions. It might be harder to create ionized oxygen than ionized hydrogen. It tells you something physical about the cloud. And also a third image, this is sulfur. And here you can see there's not much of it around. Either there's not much of it around, or it's not very excited. It's not very ionized, and so it doesn't emit very much. But you take these three images, they've been stacked, and then you colorize them. And this is the kind of arbitrary part of the process. It's very typical to use red, green, and blue because they're colors that are very far away from each other in the spectrum. In this case, I made hydrogen red, oxygen blue, and sulfur green. And you might notice that hydrogen, if you look at the bar here, hydrogen emits in red colors and oxygen does emit in blue or cyan. So that's kind of a natural choice. But until recently, I didn't realize that sulfur actually, that's hydrogen red, oxygen blue. Sulfur is also slightly red. So to make it green is not so physical. That's not the way it would look for real. But you want to choose three colors that kind of are different from each other. And so I combine them. I use GIMP. You might use Photoshop. Use your favorite layering software. Move them around so that everything's lined. And then you get a nice, pretty image out in the back. But these three colors that you choose here, I said it's a little bit arbitrary. If you look at Hubble Space Telescope images, they use a particular choice of colors, which has become known as the Hubble Palette. And I decided to try to copy them. In the Hubble Palette, they make H-alpha brown, they make sulfur white, and oxygen a cyan color. And I don't think this looks as good as the RGB. I don't know about you. That's not necessarily Hubble's fault. They also have other filters, so they might have more colors than just these three. So they'll have more detail as well. It might be that it just didn't happen to work for this particular object. That's really just up to you, up to your aesthetics to choose colors that make the thing look good. But I think I beat Hubble in this case. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to end on talking about the future and what we want to do with our telescopes. So we've taken a bunch of images. But what I haven't shown you any images of are really obvious prominent objects, planets and the moon. And we want to get into doing that using a technique called lucky imaging. So you might notice that when you take a look at the moon or planets in a telescope, it moves around quite a bit because there's something called seeing. Our atmosphere is shifting, it's very turbulent. It makes the image a bit blurry. And if you take a long exposure image of the planet or the moon, it'll average out that blurriness and make it a less detailed image. The geniuses that came up with lucky imaging realized that if you took like a video of a planet or the moon, you would take a lot of frames, a lot of short exposures, thousands of short exposures, and from those you can actually choose the images that are least blurred and throw away the rest, and only combine those images that are very detailed and that just luckily had a low level of distortion during that image. And we have a small camera set up, and so we've been trying to do that. We're trying to figure out, get through the software right now. So we don't have any of our own images here. Other people have done that. And these are with ordinary small-ish telescopes, 12-inch telescopes. You can get really detailed images of the moon, of planets like Jupiter and Saturn. So we're really excited to test that out. Finally, we also want to try to get into mosaicing. So this purple image here is the image I showed you of the Carina Nebula. But if you zoom out, you'll see that the Carina Nebula takes up a field of view much bigger than our camera can handle, much bigger than our telescope. So what we'd really like to do is take multiple images around, make a grid of images, and then stitch them together, make a really big image, and get some of these big objects. Carina Nebula is one of these. The Pleiades is much bigger than we can do with our telescope. So we're really excited to get into that. So that's the end of my talk. And what I want to say is that we're a little bit understaffed in some sense. We have 2 telescopes, and I'm kind of the only person. Another person helps out every now and then. But we're really open to getting people in and helping us out and learning how to do astrophotography without telescopes, if you would like, and sitting in with us and doing astrophotography with us, or doing it yourself on particular nights. I tend to come up about 1 night a week, but I do have a PhD that I need to write. So it would be great if sometimes I go home and I see this beautiful clear night, and I know that nobody's in the observatory taking advantage of that clear night. So we need people. So if you're interested in learning about astrophotography, or even joining us, or doing astrophotography with our telescopes, please email us at starinfo. And the obligatory social media, follow us on Facebook and on Twitter if you want to see some of the images that we put out. So thank you very much for listening. No, because I didn't have any background in taking photos before I started this. Really, it's a matter of interest, because it takes interest to stay awake at 2 a.m. taking these images. So it's enthusiasm we need more, and we can help you figure out the software. Yeah, email us, and we'll set up some times and try to train you up and see what happens. Yeah, well, we have experimented with having kind of star party workshop-y nights, where a couple of weeks ago we let people bring their telescopes in and we helped people use their telescopes, and that was very popular. A lot of people came down. So yeah, email us here, and pretty much every Wednesday night that's clear, I tend to go up there, and I think it'll be nice. The more the merrier. Yeah, so it's aligned, and it's okay, I will say, in its alignment, and it's one of the reasons. Yeah, so it's aligned under this big pillar, and we have to calibrate it to try to get the pointing very good, but it's slightly misaligned, and that's why the tracking limits how long you can take the exposure for. So the tracking, it wants to, if it was perfectly aligned, it would just track and be nice. And that's what the auto guiding is supposed to help. It's supposed to correct for those things. Well, that's why I chose these RGB, because I wrongly thought that these things were at red, green, and blue. H alpha is at red, oxygen is at blue, but S2 is at another red. Sometimes these are narrowband filters. They just take particular wavelengths, but you can also have broadband filters which take a lot of red light, a lot of blue light, a lot of green light. And when I take galaxies, I tend to use these broadband ones, and I use the right things for that. So this sort of should look like this in the real colors. Yeah, there's all sorts of issues with comparing the image to how you would see it with your eyes, because your eyes are also differentially sensitive to different colors. And so when you tend to look at things through telescopes, kind of looks white. Most things just look kind of white, and you get more brilliant colors out of photos because we accentuate colors that your eyes don't particularly, they're not particularly sensitive to. So I try to get realistic colors, but Hubble, they're not trying only to make an aesthetic image. They also say that their palette brings out the contrast in the image and lets you see different physical things more easily. So they also think it's an information-rich palette, not just aesthetically pleasing. Our telescope just does visual stuff. An X-ray telescope, I'm pretty sure you have to send those into space. They're really big, long things to get that. Infrared, those telescopes tend to be kind of radio-like telescopes. It'd be very, I don't know if you could do that. Yeah.
Well, usually, because I'm doing multi-wavelength astronomy, and usually people who are doing X-ray astronomy, they tend to color, because X-ray pretty much shows you only very hot gas, things like that. So they tend to color it in blue, and infrared has shades of red.
Yeah. Actually, this is an X-ray image as well.
Yes, yes.
On our things. This is an X-ray image
That's a Pluto.
of Pluto. Yeah.
So it's kind of depends.
Yeah, and then that also goes to your issue about realistic colors. We can't see X-rays, so you don't have a real color for X-ray. So you just have to give it some color.
You might as well pick.
There's also an issue of resolution. The resolution of an image will depend on the wavelength. So the resolution of an X-ray image will be different to the resolution of an infrared image. And so if you combine the two images, you'll have two different colors that one is blurry and one is sharp or something, and so it might actually ruin your image. So in general, it's very difficult to compare things from very different wavelengths.
Yeah, hardly ever combines totally different wavelengths. Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.